On February 11th, 2026, exactly 11 days after Nancy Guthrie vanished from her Tucson home, FBI agents made a discovery that could change everything. A black glove lying on the side of a desert road, approximately 1.5 miles from where the 84-year-old grandmother was last seen alive. The New York Post photographer was there when the FBI evidence response team carefully picked it up, bagged it, and sent it straight to the Bureau's forensic laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. But this glove is just one piece of a rapidly evolving investigation that has captured national attention and generated the largest tip response the Pima County Sheriff's Department has ever seen. In the last 24 hours alone, more than 4,000 calls flooded into law enforcement hotlines. 18,000 total tips since Nancy disappeared on February 1st. The FBI released surveillance footage showing a masked, armed individual at Nancy's front door at 1:47 a.m. on the morning she vanished. And suddenly everyone in America became an amateur detective, studying those grainy black and white images, trying to identify details that might bring this beloved mother home to her family. But here's what most people don't know about those 18,000 tips. How does law enforcement possibly process that volume of information? How do they separate legitimate leads from conspiracy theories, from well-meaning but useless observations, from opportunists trying to collect the $50,000 reward? Former FBI hostage negotiator Richard Kolko explained to CNN's Anderson Cooper that you don't just work through tips in the order they arrive. There's a trained team of analysts who assess each submission, looking for specific markers that indicate credibility and relevance. They prioritize based on specificity, verifiability, and consistency with known facts. A tip that says, "I saw a masked person in Tucson on February 1st," goes to the bottom of the pile. A tip that says, "I sold an Ozark Trail backpack to a man matching this description on January 28th at the Walmart on Oracle Road. And here's the security footage timestamp," goes straight to the top. Every single one of these tips is handled by real human beings, not algorithms. John Miller, CNN's chief law enforcement and intelligence analyst, emphasized this point. The FBI doesn't trust artificial intelligence or automated systems to make these kinds of judgment calls when a woman's life is on the line. And speaking of that backpack, investigators made a significant identification. The masked suspect in Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera footage is carrying what appears to be an Ozark Trail hiker pack. CNN analysts who enhanced and studied the surveillance images closely determined the brand and model. Ozark Trail is Walmart's private label outdoor brand, meaning this isn't some specialized tactical gear purchased from a military surplus store or ordered from an obscure website. This is a consumer-grade backpack that could have been bought at literally hundreds of Walmart locations across Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and California. It's affordable, widely available, and completely unremarkable, which makes it both easier and harder to track. Easier because Walmart has extensive security camera coverage and purchase records. Harder because thousands of people buy these backpacks every month. But investigators are now pulling sales records, examining surveillance footage from Walmart stores in the Tucson area, looking for anyone who purchased this specific backpack model in the weeks leading up to Nancy's disappearance. They're cross-referencing those purchases with vehicle registrations, with known associates of the Guthrie family, with delivery drivers who work in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood. This is the kind of methodical, time-consuming detective work that doesn't make headlines but often solves cases. The glove discovery on February 11th represents another potential breakthrough, but forensic experts are urging caution. Michael Harrigan, a former FBI agent, told the New York Post that the glove will only be significant if Nancy Guthrie's DNA is found on it. Otherwise, it could simply be a random piece of trash discarded by a construction worker, a landscaper, or someone walking their dog along that desert road. The area around Nancy's home is rough terrain, full of thick brush and cacti, with winding, narrow streets and considerable distances between houses. There are no streetlights because of local light pollution ordinances designed to preserve the area's dark skies for astronomy. This makes it easy to drop items without noticing, and it makes it incredibly difficult for search teams to spot small pieces of evidence. Bob Craigier, the former commander of the Pima County Sheriff's Department SWAT team, explained to CNN's Aaron Burnett just how challenging these searches are. You're walking through dense vegetation in the desert heat, watching for rattlesnakes and trying not to step on barrel cacti, all while keeping your eyes on the ground looking for anything that doesn't belong. The fact that FBI agents found this glove at all is somewhat remarkable given the environmental challenges. The glove is now undergoing extensive forensic analysis at the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia. Technicians will attempt to extract DNA from any skin cells that might be on the interior surface. They'll look for fingerprints, though gloves often don't retain usable prints. They'll examine the material for fibers that might have transferred from clothing, for hair that might have caught on the fabric, for plant matter or pollen that could indicate where the suspect has been. They'll analyze soil particles embedded in the exterior, comparing them to soil samples from various locations around Tucson to potentially establish a geographical profile. They'll even look at the manufacturing markers, the lot numbers, the distribution patterns to determine where and when this specific glove was made and sold. Morgan Wright, a cybersecurity analyst and CEO of the National Center for Open and Unsolved Cases, noted that this kind of comprehensive forensic workup typically takes 5 to 7 days. So we're looking at results potentially coming back around February 16th or 17th, assuming the lab prioritizes this case, which given the national media attention and FBI involvement, they almost certainly will. But while forensic technicians were processing that glove, another dramatic development was unfolding 60 miles south of Tucson in the small border community of Rio Rico, Arizona. On the evening of February 10th, the Pima County Sheriff's Department conducted a traffic stop and detained a man for questioning in connection with Nancy Guthrie's disappearance. This marked the first time investigators had publicly detained anyone in this case. The man was pulled over around 4 p.m. while he was in his car with his wife and children, making deliveries as a DoorDash driver. By the time he arrived home, FBI agents and sheriff's deputies were already there with a search warrant, and according to the man who later identified himself as Carlos Palazuelos, they had damaged 2 doors getting into his house. Palazuelos was questioned for several hours while investigators searched his home and vehicle, looking for any evidence connecting him to Nancy's abduction. Early on the morning of February 11th, Carlos was released without charges. He immediately spoke to reporters both in English and in Spanish to Telemundo, Arizona, adamantly declaring his innocence. Carlos Palazuelos told reporters outside his home in Rio Rico, "I didn't do anything, I'm innocent. Man, I hope they get the suspect because I'm not it." He explained that investigators told him he was detained because his eyes resembled the masked person seen in the surveillance footage from Nancy Guthrie's doorbell camera. They had shown a photo to his brother-in-law, and apparently someone thought the eyes looked similar. Carlos is a delivery driver, and while he doesn't specifically remember delivering anything to Nancy Guthrie's house, he acknowledged that as someone who makes dozens of deliveries a day in the Tucson area, it's entirely possible he was in her neighborhood at some point. Law enforcement sources told NBC News that Carlos was actually known to investigators before the surveillance footage was publicly released on February 10th. He came up as part of the initial canvassing of delivery drivers, service workers, and other individuals who might have had legitimate reasons to be in the Catalina foothills area. The fact that he was detained as part of follow-up on incoming leads suggests that multiple tips or pieces of information pointed toward him, not just a single anonymous call. The Pima County Sheriff's Department released a statement emphasizing that as with any investigation, they do not release the identities of individuals who are detained and later released without charges. But Carlos chose to identify himself publicly, speaking to multiple news outlets, presumably to clear his name and prevent his photo from being circulated in connection with a kidnapping case. He told Telemundo that he wants an apology, that his family was terrified, that his children were in the car when he was pulled over and witnessed their father being detained. The search warrant connected to Carlos's detention has been sealed by the clerk of the Pima County Superior Court, meaning we don't know exactly what probable cause investigators presented to obtain authorization to search his home and vehicle. This is standard procedure in ongoing investigations, particularly when the detained individual is released without charges. If Carlos were charged, the warrant and its supporting affidavit would become public record. But because he was released, those documents remain sealed to protect both his privacy and the integrity of the ongoing investigation. The Carlos Palazuelos situation raises important questions about how law enforcement balances the need to follow every credible lead with the rights and reputations of innocent people who might superficially resemble a suspect. The surveillance footage shows a person whose face is almost entirely concealed by a ski mask, with only the eyes and mouth area partially visible. Investigators are literally working with maybe 10% of the suspect's face visible, trying to match it against thousands of individuals who live or work in the Tucson area. Former FBI profiler Greg McCrary told CNN that in cases like this, you're going to have false positives. You're going to detain and question people who turn out to have nothing to do with the crime. It's an unfortunate but necessary part of the investigative process. What matters is how quickly and thoroughly you clear those individuals so they can return to their normal lives without a cloud of suspicion hanging over them. In Carlos's case, he was released within hours, suggesting that whatever investigators were looking for in his home and vehicle, they didn't find it. No evidence connecting him to Nancy's disappearance. No items matching those seen in the surveillance footage. Nothing that would give probable cause for an arrest. But Carlos's eyes weren't the only facial feature investigators were analyzing. A closer examination of the surveillance images revealed something that many viewers had missed on first viewing. When you enhance the footage and study the areas of the ski mask where the suspect's face is partially visible, there appears to be prominent facial hair, possibly a mustache. This detail is significant because it narrows the suspect pool. Not everyone has a mustache, and if witnesses or tipsters can place a specific individual with a mustache in Nancy's neighborhood around the time of her disappearance, that becomes a much stronger lead than just someone who kind of looks like the person in the video. Law enforcement sources told various news outlets that investigators are using advanced video analytics technology to extract as much information as possible. From this footage, the video was recorded at night using a camera with an infrared filter, which means colors are distorted and details are harder to discern. Edward Baker, a forensic video analyst, explained that one of the first things investigators would have done is assess the quality of this recording and determine what enhancement techniques might improve visibility without introducing artifacts or distortions that could mislead the analysis. The suspect's behavior in the surveillance footage also provides valuable information to behavioral analysts. Frank Figliuzzi, a former assistant FBI counterintelligence division director, pointed out to CNN that this individual demonstrates a degree of preparation and forethought. The ski mask, the gloves, the jacket zipped all the way up to minimize exposed skin. The backpack presumably containing tools or materials needed for the abduction. This isn't someone acting impulsively. This is someone who planned this operation, at least to some extent. The fact that the suspect knew exactly where Nancy's doorbell camera was located suggests pre-surveillance. Someone had been to this house before, or had studied it carefully using online tools like Google Street View, or had received detailed information from someone familiar with the property. The suspect approaches the camera directly, attempts to cover it first with a gloved hand, then steps away, picks up plants from Nancy's front yard, and uses those to block the camera's view. This shows problem solving in real time. The initial attempt to cover the camera with just a hand didn't work, so the suspect improvised, using available materials to complete the task. This kind of adaptive behavior suggests either experience with similar operations or a reasonably high level of intelligence and situational awareness. But perhaps the most chilling detail in the surveillance footage is the flashlight held in the suspect's mouth. This is not a common way for average people to carry a flashlight. It's a technique often used by professionals who need both hands free. Military personnel, SWAT team members, burglars, contractors working in tight spaces. Holding a flashlight in your mouth is uncomfortable and requires some practice to do effectively without dropping it. The fact that this suspect employs this technique suggests either professional training or significant preparation and practice before executing this abduction. It also indicates the suspect needed both hands free while approaching Nancy's door, presumably to handle tools needed to remove the doorbell camera and potentially to prepare whatever method was used to gain entry to the home. Remember, there was no forced entry. The doors and windows showed no signs of being jimmied or broken. So how did this person get inside? Did they have a key? Did Nancy open the door to someone she recognized? Did they use some sophisticated lock-picking technique? These questions remain unanswered, but the flashlight and mouth detail adds to the growing profile of someone who is methodical, prepared, and possibly has relevant technical skills or training. The timeline of that night continues to be one of the most critical aspects of this case. Nancy Guthrie was dropped off at her home in Catalina Foothills at 9:48 p.m. on January 31st, after spending the evening having dinner and playing games at her daughter Annie's house. Surveillance footage shows Nancy's garage door closing at 9:50 p.m. This is the last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie alive. At 1:47 a.m. on February 1st, the doorbell camera disconnected. We now know from the FBI released footage that this is when the masked suspect approached the door and physically removed or disabled the camera. At 2:12 a.m., the doorbell camera's software detected movement, indicating someone or something triggered the motion sensors. But because Nancy didn't have an active subscription to the camera company's cloud storage service, no video footage was saved. This is the video that would have shown us exactly what happened, who entered the house, how they gained entry, whether Nancy was conscious or unconscious when she was removed from the property. Instead, We have just a metadata marker saying motion was detected at 2:12 a.m., and then at 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker app disconnected from her phone. The pacemaker monitors heart function and transmits data to a phone app, which then uploads to her cardiologist's monitoring system. When that transmission stops, it means either the pacemaker itself stopped functioning, which would indicate Nancy's death, or more likely, the phone was moved out of Bluetooth range from Nancy's body. If Nancy was being transported in a vehicle at 2:28 a.m. and her phone was left behind in the house, the Bluetooth connection would break once they got more than about 30 feet apart. This 41-minute window from 1:47 a.m. to 2:28 a.m. represents the entire known timeline of Nancy's abduction. The suspect approached the house, removed the doorbell camera, gained entry somehow, located Nancy inside, subdued her or convinced her to come quietly, removed her from the house, transported her to a vehicle, and drove away, all within this 41-minute window. Former Milwaukee police detective Eric Drager, who specialized in high-tech investigation tools, told NBC News that this timeline is actually quite tight for an abduction of this nature. It suggests the suspect knew the layout of the house, knew where Nancy's bedroom was located, and had a clear plan for extraction and transportation. There's no evidence of the suspect wandering around searching rooms or spending time figuring out logistics. This was efficient, professional, and well executed, which brings us back to Greg McCrary's point about this being a targeted crime. The suspect didn't randomly choose this house. They chose Nancy Guthrie specifically, for reasons we still don't understand. At 11:56 a.m. on February 1st, about 9.5 hours after Nancy's pacemaker stopped transmitting, her family went to check on her at home. Nancy was supposed to meet a friend for their regular virtual church service, a routine they'd maintained for years. When Nancy didn't show up and didn't answer phone calls, the friend called Nancy's daughter, Annie. Annie and other family members went to the house, discovered Nancy was missing, and called 911 at 12:03 p.m. Pima County Sheriff's deputies arrived about 10 minutes later. Sheriff Chris Nanos himself came to the scene, which, as he noted in his initial press conference, is unusual. Sheriffs don't typically respond to every missing person call, but something about the scene at Nancy's house immediately raised red flags. The sheriff later confirmed that blood found on the porch outside Nancy's front door tested positive for her DNA. The amount and pattern of the blood has not been publicly disclosed, but it was significant enough that investigators immediately elevated this from a missing person case to a possible abduction or kidnapping. The combination of the disconnected doorbell camera, the missing woman, and the blood evidence made it clear that Nancy did not leave on her own accord. Since the FBI released the surveillance footage on February 10th, the Pima County Sheriff's Department has been overwhelmed with tips and offers of assistance from the community. The Catalina Foothills Association, which represents Nancy's housing development, urged residents to display yellow ribbons or flowers as a sign of hope for her safe return. Yellow ribbons have a long history in American culture as symbols honoring loved ones who are away, whether at war, held captive, or otherwise separated from their families. Driving through the Catalina Foothills neighborhood now, you see yellow ribbons tied to mailboxes, trees, and porch railings. Local NBC affiliate KVOA, where Savannah Guthrie actually worked early in her journalism career, hung a large banner outside their office that simply reads, "Bring her home." The station has been running frequent updates on the case, asking anyone with information to come forward. Community members have also been leaving flowers and notes outside Nancy's house, creating a growing memorial even though everyone hopes Nancy is still alive and will return home safely. But not all the attention has been helpful. On February 11th, TMZ reported receiving a third note related to Nancy's case, but this one was different from the previous ransom demands. The sender claimed they had tried unsuccessfully to contact Nancy's son Cameron and daughter Annie by email and text message. The note stated, "If they want the name of the individual involved, then I want 1 Bitcoin to the following wallet." Time is more than relevant. 1 Bitcoin is currently worth approximately $66,000, notably more than the FBI's $50,000 reward. The note included a legitimate Bitcoin wallet address, but crucially, it was a different address from the one included in the original ransom notes sent to TMZ and 2 Tucson television stations. TMZ immediately forwarded this new note to the FBI. Chris Swecker, a former FBI assistant director, told Fox News that he is highly skeptical of this note. It appears to be an opportunist trying to profit from the case, someone who may or may not actually have information, but is trying to extract payment by creating urgency with phrases like, "Time is more than relevant." This is at least the third ransom-related note in this case, and law enforcement has arrested at least one person for sending a fraudulent ransom demand. The proliferation of fake ransom notes is a disturbing development that complicates the investigation and causes additional pain to the Guthrie family, who can't be sure which, if any, of these communications are legitimate. The authentic pattern of ransom kidnappings was explained by Catherine Schweit, a former FBI agent who investigated a similar case in rural Wisconsin in 2003. An 88-year-old grandmother was abducted from her home in February of that year, placed in the trunk of her car, driven to the kidnapper's property, and shackled inside a trailer. The kidnapper immediately began sending messages to the woman's grandson, who owned a construction company, demanding millions of dollars for her release. The FBI worked the case intensively and captured the kidnapper 5 days after the woman was taken, returning her safely to her family. Schweit noted that in that case, the communication was immediate, aggressive, and direct. The kidnapper wanted the money quickly and was actively engaging with the family to negotiate terms and arrange payment. But the Nancy Guthrie case doesn't follow that pattern at all. The ransom notes that have been received were sent to media outlets, not to the family directly. The demands included deadlines, February 5th and February 9th. But when those deadlines passed with no payment, there was no follow-up communication, no escalation, no threats, no renewed contact. Catherine Schweit posed the critical question: if you were going to abduct somebody for cash, why wouldn't you aggressively try to get that cash by communicating with the family right from the start, so you could get your money and return the victim before law enforcement closes in? The lack of sustained, direct communication with the Guthrie family has some investigators wondering whether this is really a ransom kidnapping at all, or whether it's something else entirely, with ransom notes being sent by opportunists or people trying to create confusion and misdirection. The FBI announced on February 11th that agents were conducting an extensive search along multiple roadways in the Catalina foothills area where Nancy lives. This wasn't a random grid search. Investigators were specifically focusing on roads, washes, and pull-offs between Nancy's home and any major highways leading out of Tucson. They were working on the theory that the suspect transported Nancy via vehicle and may have discarded items along the route. This is standard procedure in abduction cases. Suspects often dispose of evidence as they're fleeing the crime scene: pieces of clothing belonging to the victim, tools used to commit the crime, personal items they took from the house. The discovery of the black glove on February 11th appeared to validate this search strategy, though again, it hasn't been confirmed whether that glove is actually connected to Nancy's case or just random trash. FBI agents were also canvassing gas stations and convenience stores along potential escape routes, pulling security footage to look for vehicles that passed through during the early morning hours of February 1st. They're examining that footage for vehicles matching descriptions from witnesses or tips, for vehicles driving unusually slowly or making multiple passes through the area, for any vehicle that stands out as not belonging to a regular commuter or resident. Investigators have also been reaching out to Nancy's neighbors, requesting doorbell camera footage for specific dates and times. NBC affiliate KVOA reported that residents in the Catalina foothills were asked to provide footage specifically from January 11th between 9:30 and 11 a.m. This date is 3 weeks before Nancy's disappearance, suggesting investigators believe the suspect may have conducted surveillance on Nancy's house weeks in advance of the actual abduction. The urgency of this request is high because many doorbell cameras automatically overwrite old footage after a certain period, typically 30 to 60 days. If residents don't manually save that footage soon, it will be permanently deleted and lost as evidence. This raises the possibility that we're looking at a suspect who planned this operation for at least 3 weeks, potentially longer. Someone who drove through the neighborhood multiple times, observed Nancy's routines, noted when she was home alone, identified the security measures in place, and developed a plan to circumvent those measures. This level of premeditation again points toward a targeted crime rather than a crime of opportunity. On the morning of February 12th, something unusual happened at Nancy's house. FBI agents erected a white pop-up tent outside her front door at 7:45 a.m. 5 agents were observed working in and around the tent. The tent remained in place for about an hour and 20 minutes, then was taken down at 9:07 a.m. The FBI declined to comment on what the tent was used for or what work was being conducted underneath it. Speculation from law enforcement analysts suggests several possibilities. The tent could have been used to protect sensitive evidence collection from the elements. It can get quite warm in Tucson even in February, and direct sunlight can degrade certain types of forensic evidence. The tent could have been used to shield the work from media cameras and drones that have been constantly hovering around the property. Or the tent could have been used as an enclosed space for specialized equipment like alternate light sources, or chemical testing reagents that need to be used in controlled lighting conditions. Whatever was happening under that tent, it represented continued active investigation at the primary crime scene 12 days after Nancy's disappearance, suggesting investigators are still finding new evidence or pursuing new theories about exactly what happened at that front door on the morning of February 1st. Savannah Guthrie, Nancy's daughter and a co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, has been notably absent from the show since her mother disappeared. She has remained in Tucson with her siblings Annie and Cameron, coordinating with investigators and making regular appeals to the public via Instagram. On February 12th, Savannah posted what appeared to be archival home video footage showing her siblings, and their mother together in happier times. The caption read, "Our lovely mom, we will never give up on her. Thank you for your prayers and hope." The tone of Savannah's messages has evolved over the course of these 12 days. The first video appeal, posted on February 4th, was carefully worded and somewhat formal, with Savannah and her siblings together addressing potential kidnappers, asking for proof of life and offering to negotiate. The second video appeal on February 5th showed Savannah's brother Cameron speaking alone, more directly pleading for communication. The third video on February 8th, following reports of ransom deadlines approaching, had Savannah and her siblings together saying, "We received your message and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. This is very valuable to us and we will pay." That video seemed to be responding to a specific communication, though law enforcement has not confirmed any ongoing dialogue between the family and suspected kidnappers. The fourth video on February 9th, just before the second alleged ransom deadline, showed Savannah alone and visibly distressed, saying, "We are at an hour of desperation and we need your help." Then came the FBI's release of the surveillance footage on February 10th, and Savannah's messaging shifted again. She reposted the images and videos of the masked suspect with the caption, "We believe she is still alive. Bring her home." And, "Someone out there recognizes this person. We believe she is still out there. Bring her home." The focus moved from negotiating with kidnappers to appealing to the public to help identify the suspect. This shift suggests that either the family has lost faith in the ransom communications being legitimate, or law enforcement has advised them that the best path forward is public pressure and identification rather than private negotiation. The FBI's statement on February 9th confirmed they are not aware of any continued communication between the Guthrie family and suspected kidnappers, and that no suspects or persons of interest have been identified. This was a significant statement because it came just hours before the second ransom deadline was supposed to expire, and it essentially confirmed that law enforcement does not believe the ransom notes are authentic communications from whoever actually has Nancy. President Trump has also taken a personal interest in this case. On February 4th, he called Savannah Guthrie to offer words of support and told her that all federal law enforcement resources would be at the disposal of the family and local investigators. Trump later posted on Truth Social, directing all federal agencies to assist in the search. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters on February 11th that she and the president had reviewed the newly released surveillance footage together. She said Trump's initial reaction was one of pure disgust at seeing the masked individual approaching Nancy's home. Leavitt added, "The president encourages any American across the country with any knowledge of the suspect to please call the FBI, who continue to assist state and local authorities who are leading this investigation on the ground. The prayers of this entire White House are with Savannah and her family at this time, and we hope that this person is found soon and that her mother is brought home safely." The White House also reposted the FBI's images of the suspect on its official social media accounts, significantly amplifying their reach. This kind of presidential attention on a local criminal case is relatively rare and speaks to both the high profile of the victim's family and the particularly disturbing nature of an elderly woman being apparently abducted from her own home in the middle of the night. The community response to Nancy's disappearance has been remarkable. Nicolette Daly, a resident of the Catalina foothills, told NBC News that seeing the surveillance footage of the monster coming onto Nancy's porch has renewed fears throughout the neighborhood. Her mother lives alone in the same community, and Nicolette said she's now worried constantly about her mother's safety. Other residents described the area as normally feeling very safe, despite the lack of street lighting and the considerable distances between homes. But the fact that someone could approach a house, disable a security camera, enter the home, and remove an elderly woman without anyone seeing or hearing anything has shattered that sense of security. Some residents are now installing additional security measures. More cameras, alarm systems, motion-activated lights despite the light pollution ordinances. Others are organizing neighborhood watch groups, establishing check-in systems with elderly neighbors who live alone, and generally being more vigilant about unusual vehicles or people in the area. Law enforcement has tried to balance providing information to help the public assist in the investigation, while not creating panic about a marauding predator who might strike again. Sheriff Chris Nanos has emphasized repeatedly that they believe this was a targeted crime against Nancy Guthrie specifically, not a random attack that could happen to anyone. But until they know exactly why Nancy was targeted, it's difficult to provide reassurances that would be meaningful to worried residents. As of February 12th, day 12 of this investigation, Nancy Guthrie remains missing. No one has been arrested. No suspects or persons of interest are in custody. The FBI reward of $50,000 remains unclaimed. But investigators are pursuing multiple active leads based on the flood of tips generated by the surveillance footage release. They're processing forensic evidence from the black glove found near Nancy's home. They're analyzing the surveillance footage using advanced video enhancement and behavioral analysis techniques. They're tracking down every person who purchased an Ozark Trail backpack from Walmart stores in southern Arizona in the weeks before Nancy's disappearance. They're pulling security footage from gas stations and businesses along escape routes. They're interviewing delivery drivers, service workers, contractors, and anyone else who had legitimate reasons to be in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood in late January. They're examining social media accounts, financial records, and phone data for thousands of individuals who have been flagged through various investigative avenues. This is painstaking, methodical work that doesn't generate daily headlines, but slowly builds a comprehensive picture of what happened and who is responsible. One of the critical factors working against investigators is time. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old with significant health concerns. She has a pacemaker monitoring her heart function. She requires daily medications that were left behind in her house. She has limited mobility and cannot walk more than about 50 yards by herself without assistance. Every day that passes without finding Nancy increases the likelihood of a tragic outcome. Her daughter Savannah emphasized in one of her video appeals that Nancy lives in constant pain. She is without any medicine. She needs it to survive, and she needs it not to suffer. This creates tremendous urgency for investigators who know they're not just racing to solve a case, they're racing to save a life. Former FBI profiler Greg McCrary told CNN that, in his experience, abduction cases typically move toward resolution relatively quickly, one way or another. Either the victim is found, or the suspect makes a critical mistake that leads to their identification and arrest, or tragically, the victim's body is discovered. Cases that stretch beyond 2 weeks without any resolution or major breakthrough are statistically rare and become progressively more difficult to solve as evidence degrades, memories fade, and the investigation loses momentum. But Frank Figluzzi, the former FBI assistant director, noted something important about the suspect's behavior in the surveillance footage. The level of preparation and execution suggests this person is trying to keep Nancy alive. If the goal was simply to harm or kill Nancy, there would be no reason for all this elaborate planning and concealment. The suspect could have committed violence and fled. Instead, this person went to great lengths to remove Nancy from her home without being identified, presumably to transport her somewhere. The fact that the suspect is carrying a backpack suggests they brought supplies, perhaps restraints, perhaps sedatives, perhaps items needed to care for a captive. Figluzzi said, "This does lead to the possibility of a legit kidnap. I'm not sure about a legit ransom plan, but that does mean Guthrie could still be alive." This assessment provides a thin thread of hope for the family and investigators. If Nancy is being held somewhere, if she's still alive 12 days after her disappearance, then there's still a chance to bring her home safely. But that window is closing rapidly. The investigation has also expanded geographically. The search of Carlos Palazuelos' home in Rio Rico, Arizona, even though he was ultimately cleared, indicates investigators are looking at potential connections to Mexico. Rio Rico is just 12 miles north of the international border. It would be relatively easy for someone familiar with that area to transport a victim across the border into Nogales, Sonora, where U.S. law enforcement would have extremely limited ability to conduct searches or make arrests. The involvement of FBI agents specifically, rather than just local sheriff's deputies, reflects the possibility that this case could have interstate or international dimensions. The FBI has jurisdiction over kidnappings that cross state lines or international borders, and they bring resources and expertise that local agencies simply don't have. The FBI's evidence response team that searched Carlos's property and that found the black glove near Nancy's home is highly trained in forensic evidence collection. These are not regular patrol officers or even regular detectives. These are specialists who know how to process crime scenes to extract every possible piece of information. The FBI has also launched a dedicated webpage for Nancy's case, which is something they typically do only for high-priority investigations. The webpage includes the updated missing person poster that now incorporates images from the surveillance footage, showing both Nancy's photograph and images of the masked suspect. It provides details about the $50,000 reward, multiple ways to submit tips, including phone numbers and an online tip portal, and a physical description of Nancy. The page emphasizes that new images released show an armed individual appearing to have tampered with the camera at Nancy Guthrie's front door the morning of her disappearance, and that the FBI seeks information that will lead to the identity of this individual. This kind of centralized information resource serves multiple purposes. It ensures accurate information is available to the public and media. It provides a trusted platform for potential witnesses to submit information, and it signals to the suspect that this investigation has the full attention and resources of the federal government, which can sometimes prompt mistakes or provoke reactions that generate new leads. The forensic video analysis being conducted on the surveillance footage is far more sophisticated than most people realize. Edward Baker, the forensic video analyst who spoke to CNN, explained that investigators will be examining every frame of that footage looking for information. They'll measure the suspect's height by comparing body position to known dimensions of Nancy's doorframe and porch. They'll analyze gait patterns. The way the person walks can be as distinctive as a fingerprint and can help identify individuals even when their faces are concealed. They'll look at the suspect's hands visible in the footage, attempting to determine if they're left or right-handed based on which hand they use to manipulate objects. They'll examine the clothing for logos, distinctive patterns, or manufacturing details that might narrow down where these items were purchased. They'll analyze the gun holster visible on the suspect's waist, trying to determine the make and model, which could lead to sales records. They'll even examine the backpack in minute detail, looking at zipper designs, pocket configurations, strap adjustments, anything that might help identify not just the brand, but potentially the specific production run or retail batch. They'll also be conducting behavioral analysis on the suspect's movements and actions. The way this person approaches the camera, the hesitation or confidence in their movements, the problem solving when the initial attempt to cover the camera doesn't work. All of this provides insights into the suspect's state of mind, level of experience, and personality characteristics. Behavioral analysts might determine whether this person has military or law enforcement training based on how they move and handle themselves. They might assess whether the suspect shows signs of nervousness or agitation that could indicate this is their first serious crime, or whether they display calm proficiency suggesting experience with this kind of operation. These behavioral insights help investigators build a profile of who they're looking for, which can be used to narrow suspect pools and prioritize investigative resources. For example, if analysts determine the suspect likely has military training, investigators would focus on individuals with service records. If they determine the suspect appears to be a novice, they might look at people with no criminal history who recently experienced some crisis that pushed them to commit this act. The infrared nature of the video footage presents both challenges and opportunities. Infrared cameras detect heat rather than visible light, which is why they can capture images in complete darkness. But this also means colors are represented differently than they appear to the human eye. What looks black in infrared might actually be dark blue or dark green in reality. What appears white might be light gray or beige. Forensic video analysts have to account for these distortions when making assessments about the suspect's clothing and appearance. However, infrared footage can also reveal details that wouldn't be visible in regular video. For instance, infrared can sometimes penetrate thin fabrics, potentially revealing tattoos or scars beneath clothing. It can detect temperature differences that might indicate objects hidden under clothing, and it provides very clear definition of edges and outlines, which helps with measurements and gait analysis. So while the black and white nature of the footage might seem limiting, investigators can actually extract a remarkable amount of information from these images when they apply specialized analysis techniques. Going back to the glove discovery, if this item does turn out to be connected to Nancy's case and if it yields useful DNA evidence, it would represent a major breakthrough. Modern DNA analysis can extract profiles from remarkably small samples: skin cells left on the interior of a glove, touch DNA from handling the exterior, even degraded genetic material that has been exposed to sun and weather. The FBI lab at Quantico has some of the most advanced DNA analysis capabilities in the world. They can separate mixed DNA samples where multiple people have touched the same object. They can develop profiles from partial or degraded samples, and they can run those profiles through multiple databases looking for matches. The most obvious database is CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, which contains DNA profiles from convicted offenders, arrestees in many states, and forensic evidence from unsolved crimes. But analysts will also check familial DNA databases, which can identify close relatives of the actual suspect, even if the suspect themselves isn't in the system. This technique has been used to solve several high-profile cold cases in recent years. If the glove yields a DNA profile that partially matches someone in the database, investigators can then work backwards through family trees to identify potential suspects. But DNA analysis takes time. Despite what we see on television crime shows where results come back in hours, real forensic DNA work typically requires 5 to 7 days minimum, sometimes longer if the sample is challenging or if the lab has a backlog of other priority cases. The FBI will almost certainly expedite Nancy's case given the time-sensitive nature. She's been missing for 12 days, she's elderly with health issues, and there's massive public and political attention on finding her. But expediting doesn't mean instant. Investigators and the family will have to wait at least another few days before they know whether the glove provides any useful leads. In the meantime, all other investigative avenues continue to be pursued simultaneously. This is why the FBI and Pima County Sheriff's Department have brought in so many resources. They're not putting all their hopes on a single piece of evidence. They're working dozens of parallel investigative tracks, knowing that often it's the convergence of multiple small pieces of information that cracks a case rather than one silver bullet piece of evidence. The 18,000 tips that have come into law enforcement represent both an opportunity and a challenge. On one hand, this massive response from the public demonstrates how invested people are in finding Nancy and bringing her home. It provides investigators with a huge amount of raw information to sift through. Somewhere in those 18,000 calls might be the critical piece of information that solves this case. Someone who recognizes the backpack, someone who saw a vehicle leaving the Catalina foothills at an unusual hour, someone who knows an individual who recently bought gloves and a ski mask, someone who heard a neighbor or coworker say something suspicious. But processing 18,000 tips is an enormous undertaking. Even with trained analysts triaging and prioritizing, it requires hundreds of person-hours to properly evaluate each submission, follow up on credible leads, and document everything appropriately. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has stated that hundreds of detectives and agents are working this case, which gives you a sense of the scale of effort being applied. But even with those resources, it will take time to work through all of these tips methodically and ensure nothing is missed. The fact that 4,000 of those calls came in just the last 24 hours following the surveillance footage release tells us that seeing visual evidence sparked something in people's memories or observations. Someone who might not have called in based on just a verbal description of a suspect suddenly recognizes something familiar when they see the actual footage. Maybe it's the way the person moves. Maybe it's the specific combination of items they're carrying. Maybe it's the backpack that triggers recognition because they've seen that exact model recently in a context that now seems relevant. This is why law enforcement was so eager to release the surveillance footage despite the risks of showing their hand to the suspect. The potential value of getting the public actively looking and remembering outweighs the concern that the suspect might be tipped off that investigators have this footage. Besides, if the suspect was at Nancy's house and tampered with the doorbell camera, they presumably knew they were being recorded and either didn't care or thought they'd successfully removed or destroyed the footage. One of the questions that keeps coming up from analysts and commentators following this case is about motive. Why Nancy Guthrie specifically? If this is a ransom kidnapping, why target an 84-year-old retired woman rather than her daughter Savannah, who is a prominent television personality with presumably more direct access to significant financial resources? If this is personal, someone with a grudge against Nancy or her family, what could an 84-year-old woman have done to provoke this kind of response? If this is some delusional person fixated on Savannah Guthrie and targeting her mother as a way to gain attention or power over Savannah, why conduct the operation with such professionalism and planning rather than acting out in some more chaotic, attention-seeking way? None of the obvious motive categories seem to fit cleanly. Which brings us back to Catherine Schweit's observation that this case doesn't follow normal patterns for the crime it appears to be. Ransom kidnappings involve direct, immediate, aggressive communication with the family. Personal revenge crimes typically involve violence at the scene rather than elaborate abduction plans. Crimes committed by mentally ill or delusional individuals usually show signs of disorganization and irrationality, but this case shows planning, execution, and a specific goal to remove Nancy alive from her home without being identified. So what's the motive? What does this suspect want? And if they wanted money, why haven't they made any verified contact with the family to arrange payment? These are the questions keeping investigators up at night, and these are the questions that the 18,000 tipsters might help answer. Because somewhere out there, someone knows something. Maybe they don't realize what they know is important. Maybe they haven't connected the dots between something they observed weeks ago and what's happening now. But the surveillance footage might trigger that connection. The news coverage might remind them of something odd they saw. The community conversation might lead them to report something they would otherwise have dismissed as irrelevant. This is why Sheriff Nanos and the FBI keep emphasizing that no tip is too small. You might think that seeing someone buying a backpack at Walmart 3 weeks ago couldn't possibly matter, but if that person matches other aspects of the suspect profile and was in the right area at the right time, that could be the lead that breaks the case open. You might think that noticing a vehicle you didn't recognize parked on your street for a few hours in January isn't worth reporting, but if that vehicle was conducting surveillance on Nancy's house, that plate number or vehicle description could be exactly what investigators need. As we approach day 13 of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the investigation shows no signs of slowing down. If anything, the pace is intensifying. The FBI has committed major resources. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has made this their top priority. The community is engaged and alert. The family is doing everything they can to keep public attention focused on finding Nancy, and investigators are following every credible lead that comes from those 18,000 tips. They're processing forensic evidence from the glove. They're analyzing surveillance footage frame by frame. They're tracking down Ozark Trail backpack purchases. They're interviewing witnesses and clearing potential suspects. They're building timelines and mapping movements. This is what real investigation looks like. Not dramatic confrontations and instant breakthroughs, but methodical, painstaking work. Hundreds of small steps that slowly narrow the field of possibilities until they converge on a suspect. The question is whether they'll get there in time to save Nancy Guthrie's life.